a duality has been introduced between a chaotic divine feminine and an ordering or ordered divine masculine. Neither of these elements can be thought away. They are intrinsic to phenomenology. They are phenomenologically grounded. We know these elements a priori. This we know, the chaos we know, because of Kantian doubt. There's the subject of knowledge, there is his phenomena, and then there's the noumenon, which is whatever the phenomena represent, the thing in itself. So I perceive the room around me, but what it is in itself prior to being filtered through the forms of my perception, that I can't know. I really can't even think about what it might be outside of the forms of my cognition, because my thought occurs through the forms of my cognition. It's like the mind is a square peg and the noumenon is the mind is a square hole and the noumenon is a round peg. It just can't enter, not as itself, only through a transformation into an idea or a representation. So I think this is more fundamental than the cogito. I think Cartesian doubt is kind of badly formed, and Schelling critiques it effectively in his On the History of Modern Philosophy. Basically, he inherits scholastic concepts of the soul and of existence, and kind of just uses them going forward in his system. It's not really this transcendental phenomenological analysis that is really a priori that Kant relies on, and Kant's system is far more robust than Descartes' in terms of a model of the mind. And that is fundamental. The order of the world is also given, cannot be denied coherently, because to deny it you'd be employing its very forms. So, these things aren't going away. That duality will, in some sense, persist, because there's an unknowability about whatever lies behind the forms we perceive. Nevertheless, there is a transcendental unity of these, because we're talking about them. Now, it may just be that we're not capable of really bringing chaos into our mind. All we have is a symbol for it. And so we can draw a circle around the symbol for it and the world of order, but we're not really encompassing that transcendental or transcendent other than ordered world, whatever that might be. And it's not even a world at that point. Words escape us to describe what this would be. The chaotic element is ephemeral. But the ordered world is likewise founded upon a kind of ephemerality, because we cannot talk about the axioms of the system. Gödel says we can't, so we can't. There is an undifferentiated, there is a simple quantum underlying logical structures, and that can't be justified. That can't be interrogated. And that is the limit of the limited world. But is that limit itself limited? Is it ordered? Is the source of order ordered? Now, to talk of a source of order is kind of, misapplying the notion of a source, because order, as we discuss it, pertains to the four metalogical laws. The most basic laws of our thinking are related to identity. That's A equals A does not equal not A is either A or not A. And really the law of the excluded middle kind of entails the other two. So there's one law of identity, intrinsic to the way that we think, and then there is the principle of sufficient reason, which talks of a series of grounds and consequence. And so when you're asking about the source of order, you're asking about the ground of grounds. And so it's circular. So there's a problem in attempting to ask about it. So this is why Kant's book is called The Critique of Pure Reason. There is a limit to our thought. But that limit itself is tantalizing because we're left kind of wondering what it would be. Not being able to conceive of it, we can't look into the face of the unlimited. But we can ask, insofar as we talk about a source of grounds, there is that other aspect of the self, which is not representative, but which is willing. And this reflects a notion from Hinduism where the arta, or kind of like infinite order of the cosmos, or I guess like metaphysical order of the cosmos, that arta is supported by dharma. So it's not just that the arta, or the logic of the world, spills down into mundane human affairs and then down into the karma of the individual. It's not all superordination, arta down the chain, it's actually up. Dharma upholds arta. And the reason for that is that for them, desire is what keeps us in the world. And if you think about it evolutionarily, and I'm going to write out this. So, arta is actually an early Vedic concept and is not used very much. I think even by the time of the Upanishads, probably you're talking 800 BC when these are written, by and large, and earlier as well, maybe 1000 to 800 BC. So you have the arta, which becomes unpopular, and then you have dharma, which is like, it's not just social order, it's like a natural law. You might view it as the arta being like the constitution or something like that, and then the dharma being case law, where the dharma is the lived implication of the arta. And then underneath that you have the individual karma. And the Hindus believe in many worlds, essentially. Brahma, opens his eyes and a cosmogonic cycle begins and closes them, withdraws, and then reality flowers forward again, an eternally recurring cycle of this. And so therefore, being who you are, where you are, in the society that you're a part of, is intrinsic to your personal karma. So you having the karma that you do, your ethical conduct, therefore the nature of your will, your desire, which is what keeps us here, it's the chain that attaches us to the world of samsara. That produces our karma, which situates us in a dharmic order, and the nature of that dharmic order upholds the arta. But it's not just that it's all a product directly of the will, because there is a sense in which there seems to be an absolute arta, that maybe the world that you're in, like, it doesn't work perfectly, at least not in so far as it affects you, but if your conduct was perfect, if your society was perfect, if you existed in like the perfect world, then that arta would cohere with the divine nature, which is that oneness, which is that chaos. And then you would have kind of what I alluded to before, which is this tree structure developing into this one. And the one up here and the one down here would be the same. Reality would be thus holographic in nature. Every part would contain the whole. And even as far back as Parmenides, this is brought out in Greek thought. Now, Plato develops his theory of forms kind of in an attempt to reconcile Parmenides and Heraclitus. And for Heraclitus, everything is flux. For Parmenides, everything is stasis. And So Plato says, well, why can't some things be in flux and other things be in stasis? So then we have an eternal realm of forms, unchanging forms, which are the only real kind of truth. And we ought to escape from the cave of the play of shadows, the world of Maya, essentially, and return to what we saw, another of Plato's allegories from the Republic, what we saw before we were brought to the earth, when the gods led us through the cosmic sphere, led us outside of it to glimpse into that absolute order as it is in itself. So this, kind of leads to a position, a Parmenidean position in a sense, where causation is illusory. If you have an unbounded will, right? So that chaos is being identified. The chain of logic of this basically goes like this. The oneness of the undifferentiated divinity that's ineffable, beyond language and beyond our thought, that we can infer that something out there is beyond our thought, because there's the limit of trying to think of what we actually perceive in itself beyond our forms of perception. That can't be denied. So that's there, and there's a leap that you can take if you accept Schopenhauer's claim that the thing in itself of Kant is actually the will. And I accept that because of Schopenhauer's arguments, but also that was believed by the people who wrote the Upanishads. Desire is that chain which binds us to this world. So the will is this, in some sense, manifested, projecting in infinitely many ways, completely unbounded. And this will, when it behaves according to law, when it wills law, that law that it wills eventually culminates in the divine mind, let's call it the nous, or nous, or whatever, which culminates in kind of the Godhead, the Theos, the omniscient, omnipotent being, culminates in that which ends up being identical with this. So this is an attempt to reconcile that divine feminine and divine masculine. You might look at it, if you're going to think causally, that the divine feminine, which in itself is not willful per se, because in itself it's not the feminine is an aspect of it. It sits at one end of the series, the causal chain that we're a part of, that constitutes our nature. So that's simple, and it leads through to kind of the telos of history, or the purpose of the world, which is to, through what we're doing, through philosophy and through science, intuiting immediately through the understanding those universals that we, in a sense, we'd be creating as the will that we are, but that kind of iterated process of modeling a thing which is itself kind of in flux reaches a limit, which, we have to think of it as a limit because there's no more form after that point, but it kind of wraps back around on itself. So that's how you would reconcile those concepts. And in that, like the causal chain is what unites this process. So the causal chain is what generates the perception of causality, but it's not actually itself what it seems to be. It is the form of our cognition and our perception, and it is the form of our mind, but that's where it is. And Maya, and it's a real structure, because if that undifferentiated didn't contain all possible perspectives, all possible agents, all possible souls, if it didn't contain that, then it would be nothing. It would be what we think of as nothing. But nothing is impossible, because it's not stable. We can't think of it. So, and we know that this is here, so clearly in the ultimate question of why is there something rather than nothing, there is something, that's given. We're not going to deny that. So this causal chain is there, but we're going to say that this is just the structure of our mind, and that extended through time, we perceive it right now to be finite, and it is. Those limits are being generated and generating the forms of our perception, but the source of the limitation, temporally even, is the inner being of the chain itself. Like, the inner being of everything is, in Schopenhauer's view, the will, and in my view, the will in itself, which Schopenhauer characterizes once as being absolutely free, because free of the forms of the principle of sufficient reason. But that thing in itself of the will is the undifferentiated, is divinity. And that's the perennial philosophy on that. That's the Atman. So your inner nature is this. And I'm going to be talking about the same things that I just did, but reiterating it in terms of subject and object, kind of, to reframe the mind. So we're bringing it back to phenomenology. So we have, in the subject, different aspects that we can call subjective. We have a willful subject, which is going to be this material here, the energy of the will, which is the energy of the matter of our body and our force potentials. And for Schopenhauer, your body is the immediate objectification of your will, and you look at someone and you see what they're like, because that's their will. And I think that, casting directors wouldn't be qualified if that wasn't the case. Like, they wouldn't be qualifiable, because then anybody could be anything. But not anybody can be anything. Who you are is who you are, and you look the way you are, because that's the way you are. So this is that will, and it's subjective in that we come to know our own will, which stems from inside, but we know of it through the forms of our representation. And so it's not truly the subject of experience. So that will I'm going to term masculine, just because it fits more in line with the archetype of the male that we have in our minds. And then the inner being of what you are phenomenologically speaking, that is your awareness, the thing that knows. The thing that knows cannot be known, because it's what knows. It is not what is known. That's what defines it. And that's one of those, what's the basis of the law of identity? Partly that you can't know the knower. So the knower can't violate its identity, so therefore it can't perceive identity being violated or something. Like, it's not in the nature of the perceiver, and therefore it can't perceive the nature which violates its own self. Kind of convoluted what I just said there, but hopefully you got it. So there is a feminine subject of knowledge and then a masculine subject of will. And that would be sort of like the Atman, which is universal, and then the Jiva, which is particular. And we've already said the will exists on a causal chain, which culminates, and we're going to take this leap going forward. We will assume that it is possible to move through the tree of forms and arrive back at the culmination of it, that this divine mind at the end is something. And so therefore the will right now appears limited, but is in its cosmic role an aspect or an expression of the infinite, of the unbounded, of God. This duality then between the will and the subject of awareness is illusory because of time. Nevertheless, it has to be there. But anyway, the will is not all. We're still calling that subjective. Now, outside of our will, there are things which affect us, and an objective world. And that has two elements. One is the objective world as accident, as the action of things in themselves, and then the object as substance, which is more feminine and receptive. And I think, in the Taoist symbol, the reason why the white dot is in the black section and the black dot is in the white section. And these are yin and yang, or feminine and masculine. And the feminine contains the feminine contains the masculine, and the masculine contains the feminine. So there's these, like, the syzygies appear in other systems as well, but just in different forms. And that's that kind of ineradicatable antinomy or paradox or tension just in the structure of things. All right. I have notes here, which is why I keep looking down. Now, the accident of things is what we're really talking about when we talk about the ordered world. So, there's here in the objective world, there is the substance of them, which is the will as well, and then there's what they do. And what they do adheres to order necessarily, because our perception is predicated on our being a part of a causal chain. So the perception wouldn't be there of the object acting in a certain way unless the forms of causality, the forms of the principle of sufficient reason which characterized us. So it's necessary that the accidents of the objective world fit into some kind of system of logic, of order. And that order, here, I'm going to talk about, like I kind of promised in the first video, I'd have to talk about the nature of a limit. So we can't conceptually reconcile the chaotic and ordered. We sit at an intersection of these elements, and they kind of resonate and keep things going. But even within the limited, say you have a shape that's limited, the border itself is not limited. Is a limit limited? Well, if it's not limited, then it's unlimited. The limit is unlimited because it can't be limited because it is the limit. So the border of a square is yes, the chalk border is, but where the shape ends, is that limited? Or if we're looking at it this way, where this is the things that we see, there is a limit to the fidelity of sight. There is a pixelated quality to things. In that sense, each pixel of the world is a limit. It's a limit to further differentiation. And it's fundamentally one in its character as expressed to us. And that oneness of the limiting factor within the picture of the world, that, is unlimited. It can't be limited. So this holographic principle returns, and we can account for the behavior of that unlimited. So we're going to say then that the nature of the limit in itself is unlimited. So nothing is a limit. When we talk of nothing, we're talking about only ever absence. And we can talk about absence only because we're perceiving certain things and not perceiving other things. So when we talk about something not being, we always mean not being here. Now, in our minds, we can talk about like something just doesn't exist anywhere. But, you're bringing a here to the table when you're talking about it not being anywhere. In your imagination, you're positing a universe, a world, and then saying it's not within this. So you're still saying it's not here. You're just not thinking of where else it might have been. But that limit is unlimited, and therefore nothing is everything. And in terms of the undifferentiated, nothing seems to be undifferentiated, and absolutely everything would also. Because there's no law that delimits absolutely everything, because then you'd have the law and everything, and you could draw a new set of the new everything that includes the law, and therefore that law couldn't order itself. Except it does order itself. just not in a superordinate fashion, not from above. It, at every point, establishes order in terms of the world as, like, the world that we know. In itself, maybe not. So that's kind of obscure. But anyway. Now, in itself, that limit to things, the quantum, could be absolutely nothing, could be absolutely everything. And this is kind of a concept that I don't know if I've talked about explicitly, but let's say, you have here a poorly drawn DNA strand. Okay, this is DNA, and then you have an atomic system here. And you have an electron right here. Well, the electron to us has a particular basic quality. If we analyze that property, it's just like a will to positivity with a particular valence. There's a characteristic of that will. But whatever besides the properties that it demonstrates to us, besides its behavior, what it is in itself could be anything. It could be everything. Just act like what it substantially is in itself. It doesn't matter if it's a little clown in there that just acts like an electron acts. The action of it is all we know of it. And so within it, from our perspective, there is a real range of possible identities of the thing that's functioning in the system. So the limiting factor is in a state of superposition. Like what it could be in itself is a distributed spectrum. It could be many things. Now, it would make sense, the first instinct for me would be to say, well then, why, in quantum mechanics, why do we see the probability distribution look this way? That's because from the point of view of the electron, given what is above it, because it is a substantial will in itself, like a thing in itself, which is its will as what it is, and from its perspective, being entangled with the system that we know, like it doesn't necessarily register information from things beyond its level of applicability. So really like macroscopic scale things happening in the distant region of the observable universe, maybe that doesn't make an impact or a difference at all to the electron. So in this model, which is an idealistic model, is basically saying like whatever doesn't make a difference for us experientially, and this electron is having a sort of experience in terms of being affected by forces. So if there's, in my view, and this is not the perennial philosophy so much as it is me like synthesizing the holographic principle of the one Brahman, or Brahman, no, Brahman. What the hell? Brahman. Yeah, it's been a while since I've read the Hindu texts. So anyway, but the one Brahman is what's the inner soul of everything. So this holographic principle is there. So I'm synthesizing it with this kind of relativistic perspective where from the electron's point of view, there's a scale of the universe which pertains to it and makes a difference. And beyond that, for the electron, its contextualizing circumstance is itself a probabilistic distribution of possible things. Now, from our position up here, more of that is solidified because it does make a difference to us. But then below the scale of the electron, below what we're affected by, maybe internally, it could be affected by a series of different things. But those things are bounded by how it affects the system on top of it. So it's not really an absolute unbounded field. This is infinite, which allows us to say that ultimately the law is illusory, right? Limitation is illusory, because at any moment anything could behave in any way. Its will is fundamentally unlimited substantially within itself. But in terms of how it fits into its, this electron kind of fits into a little dharma here, and insofar as it does that, it's possible, like what it sits against, both at the meta level and the micro level, like both of those are characterized codependently as falling into a set of probable explanations. And what determines the most probable is, in my view, something like coherence, something like harmony, essentially. Like there's a symmetry. Symmetry might be a better way of phrasing it. So there's laws which, operate at the chemical level and the atomic level, and then within the electron, that holographic principle implies that absolutely everything's down there, but the electron as we know it sits against a subset of that everything that it must be according to the holographic principle within itself, sits against that in a way that reflects its nature and its function in the system in which it consists. So, this is the center, right? This electron point is the universal Atman itself, in itself. There is only one. So that electron is there, it has its world, and at the periphery of its world is also everything, but since it has a little jiva here of will, the forms of distribution of what sits outside of its limits are probabilistic and not just a binary like superposition of on and off, but of particular forms and shapes. And at the periphery, the thing in itself at the limit, the very, very last thing that affects the electron, that's also the Atman at the center of its own circle. And the peripheries intersect, and you can draw this. This can go, this circle here can be on this kind of axis. So maybe there's this, but there's an interlocking network of ways, which I think is called Indra's web. But anyway, there's an interlocking network of Atman in itself, embodied in a jiva, in relation to the same Atman in itself, embodied in a jiva. And that is how we explain the superposition of probability and the appearance of law. And understanding that law is basically like harmonizing what's above and below to the greatest possible degree. And this is also a coherence theory of truth, where bringing the world into coherence is shaping through an act of will the outcome of probability distribution collapses, or the collapsing of the wave function. That is moving through time, which is a form of our perception, time itself, because all of this is happening within. It's projected as happening without, but it's all contained within the illimitable. Now, I never said that the perennial philosophy was not confusing, that it's not hard to understand. It takes years to understand this stuff, and probably if you have no exposure, if you've never read like the stuff you would need to have read, like primarily the Upanishads were only useful to me because I was into physics and into informational reductionism, and I thought a lot about the holographic principle and fractals and stuff like that, and I came to this conclusion that like the only way to make sense of the universe is to say that the smallest is the largest, that it contains itself. That's the only way that's kind of the resolution of the question that I asked myself when I was a kid about the limits of space. It only came into harmony for me when I made that leap. And that was preceded by other arguments for, systems nested within other systems, which I went around calling the God mind hypothesis. My first real video ever was that. I might just make that public again for the sake of history. not that I'm a historical figure or anything, but like the history of this channel, so that you'll know that. All right, but it is difficult. It is abstruse. But it's also, it makes more sense than the alternatives. But you can't really justify it purely analytically. The understanding of it has to be immediate and intuitive, which is why all of this stuff directs you away from pure reason abstraction and towards a reorientation of the mind. And so yoga and understanding the self and transforming the self and, you know, your conduct and taking it back to ethics, that's the point of perennialism. Not to know the truth, but to live in accordance with the truth, and thereby to know it better than you could have if it was just an object, an intellectual abstract object of representation. This stuff is lived. But now that we have this, there's one last concept that I'm just going to introduce here. I've talked about it before, but that we're situated amidst, and I did mention this, so we're situated amidst a superposition of possible contexts. And given that, we're going to draw some interesting conclusions about the nature of, the soul, reincarnation, metempsychosis, and there's some racial metaphysics coming up that I haven't talked about before, and I'm kind of looking forward to it, to be honest. So that's that. Part 2 done. Thank you for listening.